Hi everybody, my name is Ben Coleman. I work at Microsoft here in the UK. I'm a cloud solution architect and evangelist. So what does that mean? Well, really I go out and talk to partners and customers about what they can do with Azure. Mainly talking to developers, software engineers, architects about the Azure platform to transform their existing architectures and applications and perhaps migrate them and modernize them to use the latest capabilities, or greenfield development. Using the kind of cloud native stuff. So I talk a lot about microservices, containers, decoupling their architectures, a lot about serverless, that kind of area, and a lot around open source. So people are bringing those kind of technologies to Azure as well. And of course, through these conversations, what comes up is, okay, that's great, that's my fancy new software architecture. How do I get it out there? How do I get it released quicker? So you end up with a conversation about the actual software lifecycle and around DevOps. So I also have a lot of conversations around DevOps as well. So you end up having quite a sort of end-to-end comprehensive conversation about both the architecture and how to deploy that into Azure. So I'm going to talk a bit about DevOps and what that means around Microsoft, what that means around Azure, some of the capabilities that are both in Azure and some of the supporting services, mainly team services, as we talked about this morning, how they can sort of support that kind of overall story. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that's the worst Twitter handle I could find. All of the good ones have been taken, so you end up with the sort of dregs of all that's been left. So yeah, this is going to be a kind of jump into the real nuts and bolts of it. I'm not going to try and give you a kind of sell on why DevOps, because I think in 2018, if you're asking that question, you're in some trouble. You know, most people know they need to do this. Whether they call it DevOps, whether you just call it, rapid release or highly automated deployments, or you're just doing continuous integration or just doing continuous deployment, I don't think that really matters. If you sort of attach a label to it and a badge to it and call it DevOps, that's fine, you can do that. But the point is, I'm not going to give you a kind of idea of the theory and methodology around DevOps. I'm going to talk specifically about some of the actual real meat and potatoes of what we've got to be able to make it happen. So specifically that's VSTS, team services, and we're going to look at a different aspect of it from what's shown this morning, so a slightly different side to team services. Then we're going to dig into DevOps projects. This is a brand new capability that we're bringing out, joining up some parts of the puzzle between Azure and some of the other aspects. And then application insights. So it's a great kind of unloved capability we have in Azure and Visual Studio to monitor and learn about the health and performance of your applications. And then lastly, Dev Test Labs, trying to reduce that friction you have to getting access to environments, getting access to machines that have your dev stack, your test stack on them. So yeah, they're kind of touching on different areas: planning and tracking, deploy and manage, monitor and learn, build and test. And if I'd wanted to, I'd probably do a nice DevOps kind of circle in there alongside that. Please ask loads of questions. It's going to be quite demo heavy. And I'm going to kind of free form through the demos. So if there's stuff you want to see, you want to rewind, what did I quickly change screens there, or what am I doing? Ask loads of questions, please. Dig in and lift the lid on some of this stuff. So just to set the scene a little bit, just talk about where DevOps fits in the overall kind of Azure picture in terms of what we have. Of course, we've got the classic stuff that you'd expect underpinning Azure. We've got the kind of global infrastructure. It's now 42 regions, 100 plus data centers spanning the globe. And then on top of that are kind of bread and butter infrastructure services, IaaS, virtual machines, networks, storage, and hybrid services to link that back to on-premise. And that's all great, and people have been using this for a long time. And it's quite a common lift and shift scenario for people to move their workloads into this and kind of forget it, they're done, job's done. And I think, well, really, no, your job isn't done. You've forgotten about a huge amount of richness that's available to you in the cloud. All you've done is got your mess in the cloud, and perhaps you're paying a bit less for it. You've got a bit more flexibility about it if you just bunged it into a bunch of virtual machines. Really, as developers, you should be thinking about, how can I re-architect this? How can I start utilizing the real services that are available in Azure and in the cloud? So that's where platform as a service comes in. And I'd say that's probably 80, maybe 90% of the services that are available in Azure are really platform services. So what are they broken down to from a developer point of view? There's a lot of platform services. I'm just going to touch on still a subset of them, the ones that really developers would use to architect their applications. So we've got the classic, what we call platform services, app services, as they're known of it in Azure, for hosting web applications, APIs, mobile applications. They're kind of all different aspects of the same thing. We've now brought containers into that as well, so you can bring containers in there and run them as web applications and open that up to Linux. Speaking of containers, we have a lot of containers and microservices capabilities now. So we've had Service Fabric for a good long while. We've started to bring in Docker containers using container service, container instances, container registry. So a lot of people are looking to containerize their applications and host them in a sort of much more cloud native way using direct services like these. From serverless, starting to pull apart your code. So if you maybe start to put some stuff into containers and you've still got some integration glue in your application, that's where serverless very much fits into the picture. Looking at things like functions and logic apps to be able to orchestrate bits of your application and do integration logic and trigger stuff serverlessly. Once you've decoupled everything and you've got lots of different bits everywhere, how do I get them all talking to each other? How do I communicate? We've got lots of ways of doing that in Azure. We're not short of messaging services. Those familiar with the platform, we've got a plethora of them. The main ones like Service Bus, for a sort of robust transactional messaging queue. Brand new, which was announced a few months ago, Event Grid, asynchronous kind of push messaging between your applications, and Event Hub for large-scale telemetry ingestion. You want to bolt in some intelligence into your application, whether it's using our kind of turnkey cognitive services. So we have nearly 30 of these now, pre-built models, pre-taught machine learning models that you can utilize as a developer. Very simple REST APIs, give it some JSON, get some JSON back. I didn't need to know anything about machine learning to be able to do that, but I get intelligent responses back from these pre-built models. I might be thinking about adding a bot to my application, putting something at the front end, a different way for customers to be able to interact with my application. People are expecting this now. They'll expect a bot on the website, they expect a bot as part of the application. So bot service makes that life a lot easier for you as a developer. Of course, mobile, we've had Xamarin for a good while now. If you're building kind of native experiences on the mobile devices, Xamarin's where that fits into the picture. And then we got to sort of grab bag of the rest of it, really. Content, managing what you have as content delivery networks to optimize the delivery of that. If you're dealing with large-scale media, we've got media services for transcoding, encoding media, and linking that up with cognitive services to be able to analyze the content of the video, do real-time translation and transcription of the contents. There's a lot of cross-service synergy going on. Azure Search for indexing and optimization. So I was chatting to somebody about Redis at the start of the day. For caching, optimizing what you're doing. Traffic Manager if you start to look globally and you want to optimize your deployment across the globe. And if you've got a lot of APIs or you're looking to productize or monetize your APIs and offer them out, API management is a great way of doing that. And then the reason for this slide was actually this bit. On top of all of that, is the idea that you want to have some sort of life cycle across this. How do I deploy into all of this stuff? And that's where we bring in the DevOps and continuous integration, continuous deployment capabilities that sit both in team services, and that's got many strings to its bow. I've put some of them up there in purple, and other aspects as well. So this morning, looked a little bit as your resource manager, ARM, it's the templated way of handling infrastructure as code. That shouldn't really be in a little box up there. It's baked into the whole platform. Everything in Azure is ARM. Don't think of it as a separate thing. Everything you do in Azure has to be driven through Azure Resource Manager, and you might want to drive that through templates and take the infrastructure as code approach. Application insights to get visibility into all of this stuff and how it's performing. We'll talk a lot about that later. And then dev test labs, about a way of providing some of these environments or some of these capabilities in a self-service manner. So that's kind of Azure in a nutshell. But yeah, I'm going to focus in on team services at the beginning here. So we saw a little bit this morning some of the aspects of what team services is about. Primarily, the build and CI. We saw the application getting built and the release pipeline, deploying that to Azure. We saw the different environments. And for me, that's the real heart of the value of what team services is about. That's the real juice of it. I came from a background where I was using Jenkins a lot, so as an open source developer, and I thought Jenkins was the bee's knees. And then I joined Microsoft and saw this and went, wow, why have you been hiding this away? And I'll be completely open and honest that I didn't realize it was Team Foundation Server. Perhaps we haven't done the best marketing here, as Microsoft as an organization to understand that Team Foundation Server has a long legacy and perhaps not the best perception in the market. And what the Visual Studio Team Services is providing is so much more. It's so much richer, so much more modern as an experience. So yeah, a lot more aspects to VSTS than just build and CI/CD. Get the testing side of things. You can run load tests and performance tests in the cloud from Visual Studio Team Services. Very, very easy to do. You can manage your code in there. Of course, we saw that this morning talking about Git repositories and your source control. And I always think of it as a kind of the analog to GitHub. Whereas GitHub gives you unlimited public repositories, but if you want a private repository, you need to pay. Team Services is kind of that on its head in a way. You get unlimited private Git repositories. So it's a great way of just putting your code into somewhere private and sharing on it. And then the planning side. So that's what I really want to talk about this morning. The aspects of the work planning, tracking, managing your work. And I think it's useful. I mean, most of you guys are Windows developers, is that right? Just a quick show of hands. Everyone's a Windows developer? Right, okay. So it's not a problem for you to think of it as Visual Studio Team Services. But for many of my partners, many people I'm going out to, I'm going to meetups, I'm going to community events, they don't want to think about, well, I don't use Visual Studio, so therefore this offers nothing for me. So it's helpful for me, and I'll probably refer to it either as VSTS or Team Services, because there's a lot more to Team Services than just the Visual Studio story. It's a very open platform. So integration's a big part of Team Services, because people have a lot of existing bits and bobs they want to pull together. Whether it's be on the actual development stack they're using. I mean, you guys are all going to be .NET and Framework, .NET Framework and .NET Core, not so much of an issue. But for people who are doing Node and Java, it's kind of a bit of a, what? I can use Team Services to build those applications. And certainly on the release side, this is where we see the most need for integration. People have got lots of different tools. People have got Chef, people have got Puppets, people have got Ansible, people have got Octopus. How do I tie this all together? And really that's why I see Team Services as the orchestrator of the whole process end to end. You might have all these other point tools and solutions in there, but then tie them into one place in Team Services. It's kind of, and you could even integrate Jenkins, and if people don't want to move a whole hog to Team Services, which people often don't, you can still use some of your stuff that you've left in Jenkins or other tools, but have Team Services orchestrating that. And suppose, just reiterating on that point, it's an open, extensible platform. So the message is, and this is probably, Donovan Brown's wording, I've paraphrased a little bit here, he's the kind of guru of DevOps and Team Services with Microsoft. The idea of being able to build any platform, any language with it. No matter what you're doing, whether it's just, mobile, non-mobile, open source, or Microsoft, we should be able to deploy and build that through Team Services. And it's still available in two models as well. So we have VSTS, the in the cloud, software as a service, turnkey, very easy to get started. And there's still Team Foundation Server. The two are kept in sync broadly as a release cadence. So you can still have that on-prem, you can have it in a private cloud, or a very locked down environment for some of my customers. That's really important. They've got regulatory requirements. Code can never leave the building. Code can never leave their servers, or source code. So there's very kind of strict regulations around that. So TFS is kind of still a good option for that kind of model. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that plan side of Team Services. Show a little bit around planning what you're doing, managing that work through its life cycle. Now this slide I actually modified it because it had an end to it, and it's sort of very traditional waterfall model. Yeah, you start a project, you do some work, and then it ends. Well, it's not really the way people work anymore. There's a constant cycle in both managing the work, tracking your progress on it, whether you're using sprints, whether you're using iterations, if you're using Agile, there's going to be some sort of feedback loop there. There's not a kind of, right, we're done now, we'll move on to the next project. People have moved well past that at this stage. So, but within that, there's still the need to track what you're doing in a project context or a product context to be able to understand what your progress is and manage and control and give visibility across all of the different teams. So the idea is that they can collaborate in one place and to work together on a single project. So with that, let's have a look. So I have here my Team Services account. I'm sort of strange, I suppose, that I have my own unique Team Services account. Most organizations would have one for their whole organization and have multiple projects in there. You wouldn't be making Team Services accounts per developer. That's not good practice. So if you see that up there and you think that's what you should be doing, it's certainly not the case. So I have multiple projects in my account. So I have a demo project here where I do most of my continuous integration, continuous release work. So because this is a kind of solo project, there isn't a lot to show you around work and tracking, because obviously I don't assign bugs to myself and track work items against myself and do a Kanban board with myself. But I do have some stuff in here. So I just want to show you the dashboard here. So you can have memes if you want. That's a markdown. So you can have your own customization. That's an old meme, but it still checks out. There's lots of different widgets you can add on here. So this is actually quite a nice rich experience. You can come in and choose from lots of different widgets. You can embed web pages and web markdown. You can choose to show a deployment status in here. You can configure this different ways. So I could say which particular build definition. So in here I've got a grab bag of different things. I'm showing .NET Core, Node.js and Python, and I've got them built a regular way as artifacts and as continuous for containers to build to a Docker image. So I've ended up with 6 builds in there, but I can show any of those and their associated release definitions on my widget here, and I can add that to my view. So this is actually quite a nice sort of widget dashboard to be able to modify to your own needs. You can come in and build new dashboards for different teams with different views, and you can assign permissions to those views and do whatever you need. So you can see it's a bit of a lonely team. It's just me and John working together on stuff here. So because there's not a lot of work items in here, but there is a nice dashboard, I'm going to jump to a different project, a project called Parts Unlimited. So this is a bit like one of these off-the-shelf Microsoft companies. Ties into the Phoenix project, I think, the story around that. So it's the company behind that they talk about in the Phoenix project and their software. So in here, there's not a lot of build and release, but there's a lot more on the work item side. So it's really injected a load of work items and tasks and project information into VSTS for me to be able to show you. So this is a kind of very flat view of the world, but it kind of gives you an idea of the different kind of structures within team services for work items. So you have things like tasks, bugs, features, and epics, and who they're assigned to and their current status. I can come in here, for example, if I want to create a new work item, it could be any of those categories. So I might be assigning a new bug in here. Let's call this something imaginative. Who am I going to assign it to? One of the 2 people. If I'm typing in stuff in the discussions here, I can reference other items. So I type hash and I can reference other tasks. So this bug might be referring to a feature. Yeah, I've seen this before. I think you can ping people with an @ and you can @ symbol them. You can make a more structured links between items using this related work and related development. So I can link to a specific commit, and this will, if I have the code, which I do also in team services, I can go and find the different commits and say, this is test stuff. Yeah, that would be a good one. Link it to test stuff. And yes, you can also define a hierarchy of these items together. So based on relationships, it could be child, parent, predecessor, and then you can choose which work items you want to be able to link this to. So this all depends on your process and your methodology, how you join these things up and how you work. I mean, team services is very flexible. It doesn't really impose any process on you. How you want to work with it is totally up to you. So I have a query in here which just provides me everything. It's a very optimal query. And so I could link this bug to a particular feature and add that in there. Might want to be the parent rather than the child. And yeah, the rest of it, it's fairly standard stuff, status. I can give priorities, I can give effort, track the amount of work. I can add attachments and so forth, as you'd expect. So yeah, that's a very sort of flat view of the world. We've got different ways to visualize that, but I think you get the general idea with how to do that. So one of the things I wanted to show you, so this particular project has been set up as, I think, Scrum. So we'll see things like epics and features, and the sort of taxonomy of the different work items is determined by your process, but you can go and change that process if you want to. So I can come in here at the account level and define multiple processes. So out of the box is Agile, Scrum, CMMI, and that doesn't really fundamentally change team services, which one you pick, it just changes the naming of a lot of these items to match that given process. So I've actually got, let's come in here, I've got a custom process created off Agile. You can start adding your own work item types in here, and you get a sort of designer around building your own kind of database structure, really. It's kind of, these are the fields I want, these are the types of fields, is it a text field, is it an integer? So you can get really, really you could really pull this apart and make this your own thing. I actually have a partner that used this, not by the developers, it's used by the ops team. So they actually track incidents, problems, and changes as a kind of lightweight service desk tool within team services. They created their own custom process and named all of the items to fit that process. I'm not recommending you do that, but it just proves how kind of flexible this is. So yeah, you're not locked into Agile, Scrum, or CMMI unless you want to be. Okay, coming back to Parts Unlimited. So I was going to have a look at backlogs and have a view of this a number of different ways. So depending on where you are in that kind of hierarchy, and epics are your ultimate kind of deliverables that you're trying to work towards, you can break down epics into features. So here I can expand this out and I can see all of the features under each of the epics, and then you might have individual backlog items that you're linking to that. So yeah, this is certainly one way of viewing it. Again, a kind of flat list, but kind of useful to see where you are in the overall story. And we have got some progress in here, so we can see this has been, because this has been imported in, you can see I imported it back in sometime September last year, and then no work has been done in this project. So then it's not probably going to achieve its targets, this project, but you get the general idea that's going to be tracking stuff over time. You can also view this as a board. So if you're using that kind of methodology to be able to see what's new, what's in progress, and what is done on your epics. So it's quite easy to add new items in here. So if you're doing a kind of very quick, kind of either a stand-up or kind of brainstorming session, and you want to just get ideas down here quite quickly, you can do that, and then sort of go in later on and tidy them up, assign them to people from here as well. If you want to do some more detail around that, you can go in and actually click into the article, and you get the same kind of editor experience as you got when I was creating that bug earlier. So it's similar on features, same idea really of having new in progress and done on features. We can also visualize these. So I don't know if I've got anything linked to this particular work item, but it can visualize the hierarchy between work items. So we can see how a feature is linked to an epic, and that's also linked to another feature. And if you had a richer kind of hierarchy than I do here, they would all be mapped out on a graphical view. This is one of the extensions in the marketplace. Actually, it's quite a nice one, worth having a look at. So where it gets mostly interesting is when we go into like the main backlog here. So I'm viewing this as a board again. One of the things to pay attention to is this little sort of radio mast here. So this is giving live updates. So as I drag items around this view, other people viewing the same view will have their browsers update in real time. So this way you can do like a virtual stand-up, where you would normally be standing around a board moving stickies around. You can do that virtually online, people remotely looking in and seeing exactly what's happening. So that's a really nice feature. I could show you that with two browsers side by side, but I think you get the general idea. So this is all, again, very customizable. We can come in here and change a lot of things. We could change the columns. So I have a design and develop and test column, and we have a WIP limit here. So we limited the number of work in progresses that people are going to be doing, stop people taking loads of things off the backlog and just hogging them.
Overall or per person?
That's overall, yes. But there's a best practicey thing to say the number of WIPs equals the number of people, roughly. Yeah. And then these columns are then split into doing and done. So you've got this kind of classic Kanban process. People take it off one, put it onto the other queue, that gets picked up from that queue and taken into the next line. You can also have swim lanes in here. So we've created an extra swim lane called expedite. So things go in there, they're going to move through your process quicker. How you want to use these swim lanes is up to you. If you do have that expedite process or you've got some other process you follow, it's up to you. So and you can change the styling of things in here. So you can add rules. So this is quite powerful. For example, I want priority 1 bugs to be a bit more visible. I can come in here and say, well, I want all P1 bugs to be bright red. And if I change this to be work item type equals bug and priority equals 1. Now my P1, it goes bright red. So yeah, you get the general idea. I can be moving these things around. People will be updating them live. And as we do this, we should see these totals here change. As I mentioned before, it's kind of been imported historically, so we've got a very flat graph here, but you're going to get the totals change over time as people work on the project. And then, yeah, there's the view of the individual sprint itself. So this is where you're taking stuff off that backlog, working on it through the specific sprint, and choosing an overall capacity. So this is a capacity per person. So it's just me in here, unfortunately, working away. That's why not a lot of work's got done. And then you get the kind of classic sprint burn down chart of capacity over time. Okay, I mean, I don't want to do this to death, but I think you get the idea of what the sort of capabilities to team services are on the kind of work and planning side of things. Very customizable, lots of things you can do in there. Try it out. I mean, if you're already using team services, it's worth having a look at. There's no additional cost to that at all. Okay, let's crack on with the next subject. I'm going to talk a bit about DevOps projects, or what's known as Azure DevOps projects. So you saw this slide a little bit earlier. It's the kind of classic view we have of what DevOps is, and it's always a circle. No matter what it is in IT, there's always circles involved. I used to work a lot in configuration management and CMDBs, and there were circles involved in that. And now moving to DevOps and cloud, there's circles involved in that. Now, I shouldn't be so facetious. It makes sense. You have this idea that you do some planning, you do some development, you release it, you monitor it, you come back through that life cycle continuously. And that's really at the heart of what DevOps is really about. Now, if I was being really unfair, you could almost draw a line down this and say this was development and this was production, and that was the whole idea that DevOps was trying to do away with. But we kind of maybe ended up with that a little bit in terms of the Microsoft products. There's VSTS, which is very developer focused. It very much helps with that planning side of things you've just seen, and it very much helps with the kind of development life cycle. And that's kind of, you could think that as owned by team services. But then when it comes over to actually releasing something, doing something, making it happen, that's when Azure gets involved. That's where you're going to be able to release that using the platform services, using infrastructure as code, and then monitor and learn about that and then feed that back. So you have ended up with these kind of two pockets of capability, and DevOps should be spanning across both of those. Now, that's not to stop. Smart people have figured this out and they can tie these two things together very, very nicely, but we're trying to make that experience easier for people. So that's really what Azure DevOps Projects is all about. It's trying to span across all of these different areas, bring that CI/CD goodness that lives in team services, bring that in with the Azure platform, with a kind of infrastructure as a code approach to programmatic deployment to that platform, using the platform services, so web apps, PaaS applications, these things that are very easy to automate in terms of continuous integration, and then monitor that all from one single place. So we're bringing that under a banner called Azure DevOps Projects. A bit of a mouthful, but it's kind of a nice spanning of both the DevOps world, which has never really existed in Azure until today. And the kind of idea of this, what we're trying to work towards is be able to build and deploy any application on any Azure service in 5 minutes. So be able to take that approach, regardless of what your application platform is, your language or your stack, and put that up in Azure very, very, very quickly, to try and reduce that barrier between those two sides of things. Has anyone heard of this yet? This is Azure DevOps Projects? No, very few people had. Yeah, you don't count. You don't count. Yeah, this is an interesting one. I was doing a DevOps workshop for another partner a few weeks back, and this got announced in the evening. And I was thinking this is really pertinent to the workshop, so I ended up making some slides up on the train about this new project because it was just come out been announced that night at it was either Ignite or Build. So yeah, this is a really new capability. The idea is to give us guided process through setting up a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. So it's defined for you, kind of step you through the process. It will create that team services project. We'll even create a team services account. We'll create a code repository. It will create you the build pipelines and the Azure resources, and deploy the monitoring against that to feed all of that back into one single place. So yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the screenshots here because I'm going to show you the real thing, but you get the idea. There's lots of different platforms you can deploy to, lots of different services, and then you end up with this dashboard. So it's the idea of being that if you didn't know anything about team services or how to set up these pipelines, or looked a bit scary from an Azure, if you're an Azure guy, that could seem a bit too much. This is a much easier sort of way into that world and to creating that. And perhaps if you're a team services guy, doesn't know a lot about ARM or a lot about templating, it helps from both aspects of the world. So let's have a look at it. So this now lives in Azure. So I'm going to jump from team services back to the Azure portal, or at least our starting point is in Azure. So this is a little demo dashboard I created before this event. We're showing lots of different things in here. We'll come on to some of this when I talk about application insights, how I got some of this data on the dashboard. But I have this view called DevOps projects. You can also pin this to your sideboard here, sidebar. Don't know what a sidebar is. Yeah, exactly. That's where I put my bottle of amaretto. So yeah, it appears under DevOps projects. It's a slightly unusual one that doesn't. It's not a resource in its own right. So if you go into a resource group in Azure and you see all of the things in there, they usually exist as a resource. A DevOps project doesn't exist as a resource in its own. It's a little bit ephemeral. So you have to go into this view to be able to create them, and they don't live inside a resource group. So I can kick one of these off, adding a new project. So we've got lots of different platforms it will support out of the box. And depending on which of these you select, so these are starting with a kind of template application, a kind of get you started. You don't know anything about this. I want to just try it out. This is a good place to kind of experiment. And what it will do is it import a kind of off-the-shelf code repository to be able to stand up the application. Depending on which platform you pick, you then get further choices. So those of you familiar with Node, you can run this under Express, or you could run this directly as a Node application. Similarly with Java, things like Spring or JSF. I'm just jumping back and forth here to show you the different platforms it supports. And then obviously for ASP.NET and .NET Core. Most of you guys are going to bring your own code in. So this is where it will prompt you for a code repository and import that code into the process. But I'm not going to start with that today. I'm going to start with the kind of off-the-shelf project. So again, I can choose ASP.NET, a kind of traditional, dare I say, legacy framework, and the ASP.NET Core, the cross-platform framework. So I'm going to select that. Now, I was talking to Guy about this morning, which is quite interesting. This point I was going to say we only support application services. As you can see, we saw web apps on Windows, web apps on Linux, and web apps on containers. This appeared literally yesterday. So when I went through this demo last week, I thought, I've got it all, I know what I'm going to show. I'll make sure I make a point that it doesn't support virtual machines. They go and add virtual machines. So yes, what was we saying? There should be the buzz phrase of a CSA. That wasn't there yesterday, as whenever we're doing demos. So we now support deployment to virtual machines as well. So this is growing all the time. And you'll see there's actually a little note down here saying, let us know what you'd like to see. So this is really new as a feature, and we're evolving it all the time, almost daily. So if you're going down the containerized route, this is a quite simple entry into that world. If you're not sort of comfortable and familiar with Docker, this will start creating the Docker containers and Docker files for you. It's a nice approach. Let's go down the traditional Windows web app. I'm going to do one more zoom. Is that going to help? So we can choose whether to put this into my existing team services account, or it will actually create me a brand new team services account. I can choose which project to put it in. So this will be a new project. It's going to build a new project in there and put everything in there. Now, actually, I should not have a space in there. It does actually let me put a space in there, but it will probably come out of an error. It will also create me a web app with the same name as that project, but I can change the name of this. So I could say web app. Those who've used the platform services in Azure be aware this has to be a completely globally unique name. I can't pick something anybody else has picked because, well, nobody has picked for Azure websites.net. So unfortunately, things like demo were taken many years ago. But this one should be unique. Got a green tick. I can choose where I want to run it. I don't want to run it in South Central US. I want to run it in Europe. And if I want to further customize this, I can choose things like the sizing tier, pricing tier. So I might want to put this on a basic, and I want to monitor it from West Europe. It also creates a resource group for me. So I have a convention in my own subscription here. I start everything with temp.dot. That means I can blow it away at the end of this demo. Saves me costs and saves me getting told off by my manager for my Azure bill. So that's, that's walking me through the process. So that's going to churn away. That's going to do a whole bunch of different things now behind the scenes. The first thing it's going to do is create that resource group. Let's filter this down so you can see wood for the trees. So that's that new Grey Matter event web app resource group, and it started to deploy some of those resources in there. Application insights, which we'll come on to next, the app service plan, it'll deploy the web app. Then what it will do is go over to team services and create me that project and create me those 2 pipelines. We could either sit here like lemons for the next probably 6 minutes and wait for that to happen, or we can go and look at one that in Blue Peter style I created earlier. So let's do that. So I'll come back to this DevOps projects view. As you see, it's still creating. It hasn't even put it in this view yet. But I've got this other one I created previously, a managed activity called DevOps project demo. And this has been running for a while. So we got the web. This is quite a nice way of bringing together lots of information. So it's bringing together my CI/CD pipeline as a view of the code commits, any builds that have been run, any releases that have been run, a link to the repository itself, a link to the Azure website, the status of the app service where we are, and application insights monitoring it. So it's just like a little kind of, at a glance view of the health of end-to-end of my application. And then up here, I've got lots of links to various things. This is where it then links back to team services. So all of that is behind the scenes, of course, as team services. It's not been handled by Azure. So you can see my sites are probably not doing very much because it's a demo app. I'll try and bring that up here. So it's just deployed from that standard off-the-shelf Microsoft code repository, a very basic .NET Core web application. I've got this deployed in the cheapest service plan I can, so it's probably gone to sleep. That's why it's taken a little while to wake up. There we go. So I can see in here it's also created me these continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines. So I can click any of these and go off to team services and have a look at what it's built for me. So the key thing to bear in mind is I didn't create any of this myself. This was all automatically created. The project, the pipelines, that's why they've got sort of slightly unusual names. I wouldn't have really called it DevOps Proj-CI. I would have given it a more meaningful name, but it's been auto-generated. Yeah, I can just edit this like any other build process. So just like the ones Ricardo was showing this morning, I could change this to a new name. Oh no. I don't know if you change the name, whether DevOps projects will get confused. Let's not break it. Let's not break it for tomorrow's demo. But this has built this pipeline for me. It's the standard .NET Core release process, the build, publish, so forth. So those who are familiar with .NET Core will be very familiar with these kind of steps. I didn't need to know anything about .NET Core to do this. This was put in here for me. Correspondingly, there's a release. So again, called the same name as the project, but .cd. And I can have a look at that release process. I suppose in a way, this is probably the most minimal release process you could get in team services. It has a single artifact, which is the output of my build process. This artifact drop. I have a single environment, which is just called dev for me, and a single phase in there, which is deploy the app service. And it's about as basic as you can get. But the nice thing about it is it will work out of the box. You don't have to go in and customize it and change it. So while we've been waiting for that, let's see if the other ones come up. There we go. So the Grey Matter event one is now been created, and it's going through that build process. So we're now into the GM event one, and it's running that equivalent CI process, running through the .NET Core installer, and it's going to deploy that into Azure on top of that app service. So the nice thing about it is, it's bringing together a number of different things, Team Services, App Insights, and Azure into one portal. I think if you're very, very advanced with Team Services and very, very advanced, well, not very advanced, medium advanced with Team Services and infrastructure as code and ARM templates, you perhaps would be mature beyond what this can do for you, but it's great as a kind of starting point for people. Okay, any questions? Did it make sense?
Clearly I can start with that and build out from it. Add new environments.
Yeah. Once it's created, I could come in here and do whatever I wanted to this particular process. Yes, I could, for example, clone this and then say, I've got not just dev, I've got my staging or whatever it might be in your pipeline, and let's clone that from the existing one. So you should use those tasks, those parameters, the variables. But I'm not going to risk breaking it for tomorrow's demo. I would love to go and have a play, but so we can wait for this one to build. But I think you get the general idea that what it's going to do. Once it's built this, it's going to deploy it into that web app, this particular web app here. In fact, if we went to it now, we'd probably get the standard welcome to your first web app page before the code gets deployed. For those who've played with app services, will be very familiar with that screen. Okay, let's move on. Application Insights. Has anybody used it? Familiar with it?
You get annoying emails from it.
Okay, so you must have one set up somewhere. Yes, I get my daily digest or weekly digest from it, yes. So Application Insights is a way of monitoring your applications. Just, boil it down to what it is. Idea of collecting telemetry from a number of different levels, from the application itself, from the browser, from the server, and feeding that into one melting pot, if you like, of an Application Insights instance. So it's purely, I'd say almost SaaS, really. You create one of these in the cloud, you use it. It's a kind of, you only pay per use, and you just pump all your telemetry into it and then make sense of it, understand it, visualize it, report on it. So it's kind of very flexible. It's kind of a place where you can send events and data. We provide SDKs and libraries to make it very easy and instrument your existing applications. But if you want to customize it, put your own events, your own instrumentation, send your own data through to it, you can. So it's really just a place to monitor and manage.
For consuming data, is it only about it's like a BI connector or anything?
Yeah. So it's probably on one of the slides. I don't know if I hidden it. There's the analytics. So you can get really deep on this stuff, pull it apart, and then write your own custom queries, and then visualize those queries using Power BI. It'll actually export your query as a M query. Is it the Power BI format of the query language? Gives you the query definition, and you can bring that into Power BI and start visualizing it. So I did this actually for a number of things. Actually, I brought the synthetic monitoring. So we're monitoring from different endpoints from around the country, around the world, and then put that in Power BI, and the size of the dot was the response time from that particular region. So I ended up with a big dot in Australia and a small dot in Europe. And so just a nice way of visualizing the raw data, which would normally just be a stream of numbers. So where do we get the stream of numbers from? Different sources of telemetry. Kind of the top level, and you can put this on top of any application, is what the user behavior is. So you can instrument this inside the client-side code, very similar to Google Analytics or any of these tracking things. You put some tracking snippet in your client-side HTML or JavaScript, and then you can track what users are doing. If you're instrumented inside your application, you can then start to see what the stack traces, exceptions, errors, logs are inside your application. What's the performance and sort of behavior of my application, what's happening inside there, service dependencies, components that my application is calling, response time between those dependencies, exceptions, and so forth. Infrastructure performance, so you can bring in the metrics or information, say perfmon counters around the server that your app is sat on. Depending on the application platform, you may get more or less metrics there, depending on where it's residing. Certainly things deployed in Azure, you're going to get a full gamut of data. And then synthetic tests, checks that you've put in, inject into your application. So is my site available? Is it running? user journeys throughout the application. You can run all of that as well. So, this would fall into the category which, while I was working at HP about 10 years ago, we talk about application performance management. It was a big thing. People spent a lot of money on solutions to do this, and they would pay for teams of people to come in and implement solutions to do this. And we talk about APM as a big thing. It's kind of crazy now. I can go into Azure and turn a switch and pay £1.70 per gigabyte and have this thing for me, which was something that we were talking about, even 5 or 6 years ago would take, a whole team of people to stand up. So there's really, really kind of rich capability you can get out of this. Bring all the data in, detect what's going on. It will proactively look at your data and run machine learning models on it to analyze what's happening. Triage when you've got issues and drill down, performance issues, exceptions, end-to-end traces, and then operationalize this with alerts. So with your annoying emails, it could be webhooks or logic apps or other ways to notify people when there's data, because you don't want to sit here and look at a dashboard all day. No one wants to do that. You can if you want. I'm sure you've got better things to do, which is developing your application. So the thing with App Insights is not just for .NET. So again, it's called Visual Studio Application Insights, and I think the Visual Studio bit has sort of dropped off over time because it does support a lot more than C#. So we'll support obviously C#, .NET Core. Probably where you get the most functionality. Most out-of-the-box functionality is if you're writing in .NET. However, I write a lot in Node.js, so it supports that fully as well, and a whole range of other languages. And other application types, if you like, as well. Mobile applications, obviously Azure Web Apps, serverless applications, so there's turnkey integration with Azure Functions to get data out of that, and various logging frameworks and CMSs that will support this. So I used to have my blog, which is a WordPress blog, send a load of information to App Insights. It seemed a bit crazy because I was only about 6 visitors a week, but it was good to have visibility into those 6 users. So it's very, very flexible. And it doesn't have to be in Azure. That's the kind of key thing. If you've got applications still on-premise.
Can I ask,
yeah.
Sounds very interesting. How would you implement that into, say, a Node REST API? Would you inject functions, calls for...
So is the REST API hosted as a Node application?
Yeah.
Using, say, Express?
Yeah.
So that Express application would be running in Azure as a web application.
Okay.
You can turn on application insights for that web app, and you automatically see the data for that.
Can I...
and you need to add a package to your Node code.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I could trace function calls within it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've done that. And back-end dependencies. So if your application on the server side is making other calls to other REST APIs, you'll see all of that in the map. I'll show you some of that. Yeah, that works with Node.
Great.
Yeah, it's really good. So yeah, you might need a little bit of instrumentation on the code side. You need to add the App Insights SDK to it.
Yeah.
Not everything comes for free. Yeah, you can do that. So it can be in Azure, obviously. That's what we'd like it to be. But if it's not in Azure, don't think App Insights is out of the picture. You can still use it. So we did talk about this a little bit. Yeah, behind the scenes, there's a big data engine where all this data goes into. Thing what we call internally called Custo. So we put all of this data internally behind the scenes, even for applications you're not monitoring. We're gathering data and events and telemetry about the Azure platform. And what we've done is we realized this was a really powerful capability, so we've made it available to customers in the form of App Insights, and OMS Log Analytics uses the same technology, the same query language, the same syntax. So you can do custom queries on the data and visualize these in Power BI, Excel, whatever you want to do with the resulting data. So if you want to get really funky with this stuff, you can do that. Right, let's take a look. Let's publish the changes. So I'm back in Azure. I'm on a dashboard here where I've got a number of different things. For those who haven't used a lot of Azure yet, the idea in the Azure portal is you can have multiple dashboards and you can pin items to these dashboards, be they reports, be they views, be they graphs, from lots of different sources. So in this particular dashboard I created for this particular event, I've pinned some what I'd call traditional Azure things on here, like a resource group, a view of all my App Insights, but then actual data and reports in real time are coming from Application Insights and other sources. So you can customize these. Some of these you can be able to resize dynamically and move around your dashboard. But most of the time you go into something, find an interesting view, you click pin to dashboard, and then come back here and resize it. So let's have a look at application insights. I have a few of these kicking around in my subscription to show different things. I'm going to focus on this Contoso one here. So this is another one of our classic Microsoft turnkey applications, Contoso Sports. So let's take a look at that. It's a cheesy sport website or kind of e-commerce site where people can browse and buy baseball socks. I'm sure that's very aligned to everybody's business here, selling a lot of baseball socks. So I can browse this site, and I'm doing this so I've got some data. So things that I'm doing here in the browser is being tracked by application insights, and it's being fed back to Azure. Let's just close some of these tabs so I know where I am. So this is being monitored by this particular App Insights instance. And just to give you, a very quick overview of what this application is and how it's architected. It's a very traditional, I guess, two-tier .NET MVC application. So there's a SQL database behind the back end. I have app service plan. I've got 3 websites, one providing an API, one providing the front end, one providing the back end admin view. I've got a couple of deployment slots, but basically it's a web app with a SQL database behind it. And App Insights Monitor. So what does it let me do? One of the key things on this kind of overview page, if you can't see it, is this instrumentation key. So this is this key piece of information you'll need when you come to instrument your apps. Is when you create the SDK or add the SDK to your project, you'll need to add the key to your project. You can do this kind of statically. You can put it in a config file inside your source code and App Insights XML file, or you can do it more dynamically. So if you're running this in Azure, in App Services, you can set this as an application setting actually at the Azure level, and it will be picked up by the SDK dynamically. It's a much better way of doing it. The key thing is to have this key. And it's from here I could launch off into analytics. I'll come back to that in a minute, but that's where you can get into the kind of real deep dive of things. Let's start off looking at the application map. So App Insights will build a map up of your application based on what it thinks is going on in there. So I can expand this out. We can explain what's happening. We've got 2 checks. These are the synthetic checks against the application. I'm just checking the home page is available and the store page is available, and they're passing 100%. I can see any page views from the client side. So we can see I've had 36 page views. That doesn't sound like a lot. What I can do is I can change this time frame here. So I can look at a longer time frame. Let's say 30 days. And it will bring the data in from that larger period of time. So you can see I've actually had nearly 700,000 requests to my application and 30,000 requests off to the SQL database. So this has all been built dynamically. Once I instrumented my application, it builds this map from the dependency calls. So we can see all of the calls being made. If I click the little green tick here, I can see those back-end dependencies charted, and I can sort these, filter on these. There's lots of different ways of drilling down to this data. So that's the application map. It's a nice place to see what's happening inside your application visually. We have the smart detection view here. So this is where it will go in and run models and try and learn about behavior correlations between different events inside my application. I don't have an awful lot going on in my application, so I don't have any detections here. For using .NET Framework, you get live metrics. So this is, you won't get this with Node.js. I've tried, and there's actually an open GitHub issue around this. So we're tracking work on trying to bring this across to Node.js. But this is a real-time view of data. So if you've got a real performance problem, a P1 you're looking at on your site, this would be your first place to look at. So anything I do on the site here, let's go, hello, mum, that is a page that doesn't exist. I will see real-time. I've got a failure rate, an exception, and I can drill down to that exception as they happen. So if you're seeing hundreds and hundreds of 500 errors or 302s or something weird going on in your application, this would be a place to go and start to diagnose what's happening. One of the things to be aware of, and this is kind of a general Azure problem, we're moving so fast. Quite often we're kind of adding new functionality. We need to keep some of the old functionality there. So App Insights is no exception to that. You'll see some of these views say preview in them. So we're bringing in new reports and views that are superseding some of the old reports and views. And sometimes we keep both of them around. So you end up with 2 different ways of going to it. Don't worry about the fact there's a preview in it. App Insights is not in preview. It's a live service. So I can come in here and actually bring up my own reports on different metrics. So I could pick from this picker of different metrics. I might want to look at good old CPU metrics in here and choose the different aggregation. I might want to add another metric to the graph. Failed requests, there's probably only a few of those. Well, that looks interesting. What I want to do is click this pin, and that's going to pin it to my dashboard. So now I have this graph over here on the dashboard. I can move this around, customize this however I like. I might think that's a bit big. So that's was saying earlier about how you can start using App Insights to build up a customized dashboard. This is a published dashboard, so this is shared by multiple people. Normally you have a dashboard that's just for you and your own view in Azure. This is a shared one, that's why it's nagging me to publish changes so that everyone else sees what I've been looking at. So lots of different reports and views in here. I'll go through every single one. Availability is interesting. This is where we set up those synthetic checks against the application. So I have those two basic checks. So where am I checking the store from these different locations? You can see the kind of very different performance from Australia versus Europe, because obviously my site's in Europe, so there's going to be a much higher latency for those. And adding these tests is really easy. And in fact, the URL that you're checking doesn't have to be your App Insights site. So if you want to ping somebody else's site or monitor something that, regardless of whether you actually instrumented it with App Insights, you can do that. If you're really interested in the performance of somebody else's site, I would recommend it's one of your own. We can also bring in web tests. So if you use Visual Studio and recorded a web test, if you're using the web test capability, you can import them and run them on a regular schedule.
Is that just the declarative model, so web test, or can you use recorded web tests on that as well?
I think it's just the declarative. Yeah, it's no, because I think it has to run completely headlessly from lots of different, from these different locations. So you can pick which of the regions you want to run it from. But yeah, I think you're limited by the type of web test. And you could choose, what's my success criteria? Am I looking for a particular string in the page? Because I've had this problem before. Sites that return a 500 or 400 error, but actually a valid page. Or there is an error, but I get a 200 and there's no, but the page says error. There's lots of confusing situations with people who design websites. So it's good to check for the content of the page, some sort of valid string in there. This is brought out from my own bitter experience. And then, alerting on this. So this is where we touch on a little bit about some of the alerts. So this will automatically create an alert for the people who own this App Insights, or I could notify other people. You could choose, for example, I want all locations to be failing or just 2 of the 5. You've got some quite sort of nice logic in there of how you want to do that. So I might say, look, all sites have to be failing for 15 minutes before actually triggering this alert to stop you getting spurious errors. And it could be a webhook. So you've got an endpoint, something you want to ping, run some process, you can do that. Speaking of alerts, we have, I'm going to scroll down this long blade. If you want custom alerts or your own kind of bespoke alerts on top of any metric, you can do that as well. So you can come in here, choose a metric alert. What metric am I interested in? Say, boring old CPU again. If it's greater than a particular threshold over a period of time, then notify people. So it's kind of traditional kind of reporting notification technology. And same webhooks, or even call a logic app. If you're using logic apps, you can run a kind of workbook kind of process inside the logic app. So one of the nice things is being able to drill down to when there are issues, or drill down to actual individual transactions. So we can see in here both performance view, and I can look up back-end dependencies. So in this case, it would be SQL calls. These could be API calls, whatever it counts. What App Insights calls a dependency is anything your application at the back end is calling. Typically a database, could be some back end API, and lots of different technologies that it might be calling. But App Insights just calls them all dependencies. And you can actually zoom in on this. You can just pick a particular time frame, look at a particular subset of the data. And then we can see these individual operations. I could click on that one, and take action against that particular process. This one's like run quite slowly, so I might want to understand what actually happened inside that transaction. I'll get a view of both the web side of things and any back-end database. So that actually had an error because nope, that page didn't exist. So we're getting a performance, not a performance problem, but actually an exception, because I should probably be trapping that in my application.
And again, we can have that throw an alert.
Yes. So let's have a look at some longer time frame here. Let's have a look over the last 30 days. Let's have a look at this shopping cart page. You can see we've got 18 samples here. It's suggesting one to look at, which is perhaps one that it thinks is more interesting, or I could come in here and look at this one because it's quite slow. And I can see all of the different statements, SQL statements that were called for that particular page. So we can actually see, select. So there's 4 different database statements, and actually see the user who was coming from at that particular point in time. So that's user that triggered that transaction for your database, well, for your whole application end to end. So that's, there's a lot more in here. I can go through every report and view. It's not terribly interesting. The whole side of application insights to monitor what the user's doing, kind of user experience, is a kind of whole different side to App Insights. It's much more focused at a kind of different kind of user. Even perhaps the marketing people would be interested in who's using your site, how they're using it. So we're very much in kind of Google Analytics kind of side of things with that. To show you that, I'm just going to come into a different monitor. So we have a site here we're running in the UK called Azure Citadel. It's where we post our hackathons and labs and guides. So there's a real site. It actually gets some real traffic, unlike my Contoso Sports site. So I'm going to show you that view for that particular site. So this is then showing us, user sessions against our application. Lots of different ways of slicing and dicing this. So I might want to slice and dice it by country. So I can see most of my users are in UK, and then split it by what page they're going to in the site. So I can see a lot of people are going to the workshops. The ARM workshop site is very popular in the UK. As you can imagine, there's a whole host of different ways of slicing and dicing this. If you're really into the kind of analytics of what your users are doing, you can gather all of that information, get individual user sessions and journeys for your site and see what they're doing. One of the nice ways to visualize that is this user flows. So you can see what the journeys are through your site, what the different routes people are taking. Are there any dropouts? So people are getting to a certain page and never going any further. You can do all of that in App Insights. So I could filter this, start excluding my events and see, well, who was interested in ARM nesting templates, create a graph of everyone who went through that page. So very lastly on this, just questions about pricing and features of this. So everything I've been showing you is in the kind of basic tier. It's actually free. So the first gigabyte of data is free. Beyond that, you pay a whopping £1.71 for each gigabyte of data. And I've found, unless you're really instrumenting the hell out of your application, this is very, very cheap. You'd have to be instrumenting a lot of data, every stack trace of every single DLL call to be able to really blow the budget on this. But if you want to, you can actually buy this as part of an OMS license agreement as well. And if it does get too much, you can actually change how data sampling is. You can actually look at where the volume of data is coming in from, try and work out if you've got a problem with a particular component, start turning off logging in that. Or if you want to, start taking just a subset of the data. Take only 25% or 30% of the data. You've still got some monitoring your application, but you're saving costs. Okay, that's App Insights. Any questions?
I can't remember if I missed any buttons for it. I thought it was a feature that you could associate issues and create work items straight from them.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you for reminding me. Work items. So if you want to, you can link your App Insights to Team Services and be able to then track problems. So I haven't got this linked at the moment. If I link this to my Team Services account, when I detect problems and failures in here, there's a button to say create a corresponding work item with the information about that, some of the context of what App Insights has detected, so the person who's going to work on the bug has got some idea what's happening. Yeah. Yeah.
Question. You mentioned mentioned about it doesn't have to be something that's in Azure. Does that mean this could also be used in like a mobile app or
Yep.
a desktop app?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So yeah, that's kind of bringing. So there was some stuff in things like Hockey app. Yeah, instrumentation. A lot of that's moving into App Insights.
Okay.
So if you instrument a mobile application with the SDK, the data should come through as well.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
So like an on-prem Windows app post data as well.
Well, it would need to see. It needs to be able to see Azure. It needs to be able to see the App Insights endpoint. So behind the scenes, there's a URL that your thing's trying to send all the data from. So if you've got a very locked down app and you'll see all this HTTP traffic going out suddenly to the strange address, that'll be App Insights doing that.
It's just HTTP endpoint.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Right. One last thing. Let's talk about Dev Test Labs. So what problem are we trying to solve here? And I guess as developers, you'll all been acutely aware of this. And certainly if you've been around a long time, if you've had access to, before you're working in the cloud, working on premise, and you want a new dev environment, new test environment, it can take weeks or months, or sometimes 6 months. What was it? That particular public sector companies. Yeah, that's not unusual. And obviously just completely scuppers any release cadence you might have. And then people went, well, okay, we'll go into the cloud and we'll put down our credit card and we'll just build VMs and we're developers and we don't care. Costs got out of control. You got a kind of VM creep, people just building more and more machines. Kind of access control. It was like, well, we'll just give everyone admin access. This was easy. And there's just lots of problems we kind of caused ourselves by doing this. And getting access to the latest releases and latest versions, people uploading stuff to blob storage accounts full of, petabytes of binaries and things. You can get really, really messy really quickly. But the idea is, we don't want to, screw this down so tightly that developers can't do any work because we're back to where we were beforehand. But we want to be able to provide some sort of control and governance around it. So trying to kind of reduce that friction between the IT admin who probably owns the Azure subscription, probably owns the bill for the Azure subscription. They're the person that wants to try and govern this a little bit, and the developer and the tester who wants to have free reign and wants to be able to have environments, when he needs them. So the answer really, Dev Test Labs is trying to solve that. It's really fast, easy, self-service access to environments, be they for dev, be they for test, be they for other reasons actually. The key thing is automation. The key thing is self-service. So providing that route in for developers that isn't going into the Azure portal and kind of writing a load of PowerShell and automating stuff themselves, a slightly more guided process. So there's a few scenarios this might fulfill. Got this developer here who's got his laptop behind him. I don't know how he's working like that. But you've got developer machines. There's going to be a whole slew of things that a developer needs on his machine to be able to run and build, to be able to do his development work. And this kind of, building a new dev machine can be a real headache. The idea is to try and automate that, bake all of that into a single template or a single process, and be able to provision those on demand in the cloud with all the tools, with everything that a developer needs, without needing to wait around. The other more classic use case really is for the test environments themselves. So when a developer's doing some work, checks in his code, creates a new instance in Dev Test Labs, runs those tests against it. Hopefully Team Services is orchestrating this. He's not doing this manually. Depends on what your route to live is or what your methodology is. You'd be using virtual machine images to do this. Some people still do that. They use things like Packer. They capture a golden image of their virtual machines and use that as their route to live, as their deployment. So Dev Test Labs is great for that use case of capturing images around what you've done. And then there are other kind of non-dev test use cases, things like training and education, where you want to give a lab to people, the same consistent environment, and have everyone have access to it, and come and be able to say, that's my machine for the week or the day or whatever. And kind of closely aligned to that as well, there's kind of hackathon, where you create a lab or a hack and you want to give access to some machine, and you normally have this long setup instructions, make sure you've got these things installed. It's quite nice to be able to say, here's a bunch of machines already in Azure, to go and use them, log in, start using them, and can throw them away at the end. And the developer or the guy running the lab can pre-build these and can pre-configure them, so kind of get started much quicker. So the idea with Dev Test Labs, really, self-service with some degree of control around it. You can put policies in there and thresholds to govern what costs are and limit what people are going to be able to do. Limit what they can do around virtual machines. And a great way of saving costs, and people forget to do this, is to shut down their machines and start up their machines. So things that don't need to, dev test environments traditionally do not need to be running overnight, people are not working on them, shut them down to save costs. And people will forget to do this, so Dev Test Labs makes this a kind of automated process. So then, your developer can come in and self-service against the Dev Test Labs and not need to worry about anything else. It's available to him in Azure. So you can build your own stacks in here. You can bring in your own artifacts, so your own libraries, software, tools, ARM templates if you're going down that route, and what we call build formulas, which is like a mini template, which is deploy this image plus layer these artifacts and software on top of it, and that's a sort of standard formula for building one of these things. And if you want to, bake them back into your own images, your own disk images once you've done. But the idea is to have self-service access. So I have a Dev Test Lab environment set up in my Azure account here. I didn't give it a very imaginative name, so it's just called Demo Lab. And this is kind of almost like a mini portal within Azure, if you like. If you would lock this down, so give this only developers access to this was the only place they would need to go. They wouldn't go off and build their own resource group and build their own virtual machines. The whole interface should be through the Dev Test Labs kind of experience. So you can kind of govern and control this lab and customize it however you like. I've put a silly announcement in here where you can put your own markdown, your own text, some information to the developers about the lab. It doesn't have to be pictures of kittens. It can be more serious. Could be dogs. Yeah, that's coming in the next release, actually. It's on the roadmap. And it's same for support. So, I always get this problem. Who do I call when my dev machine or my test machine's broken? Who's the contact? You can put your own kind of custom support information up there. So this is the kind of main views you would get both as a developer and as an admin. You have this view of my virtual machines, the ones that I've created. As an administrator, I can also see all virtual machines, so I can see ones that other people have created. And there's also a view of secrets. So this is where you can set up individual secrets for your particular lab. These are held in Key Vault. So behind the scenes, this is all encrypted and stored in Azure Key Vault. If those of you who use Azure Key Vault, it's a bit of a pain. So this actually makes it much easier for developers to be able to store secrets because they can just type in foo and the secret, and that's stored in Key Vault. If you've ever tried to do that yourself, it's, with Key Vault, you've got to worry about service principles and all sorts of things. So it's making that whole experience a lot more slick. So yeah, what you're not seeing in this particular view of Dev Test Labs is what that looks like in terms of Azure. And the developers and users should never need to see this. But inside Azure, behind it is Key Vaults, storage accounts, networks, and the lab itself. So all this complexity has kind of been hidden away, makes life easier for the end users. So I'm going to come at this a little bit backwards and start talking about how you would configure one of these from the kind of admin side of things, because that makes a lot more sense in terms of how this would be set up. Why is that blank? That should not be blank. Let's come into this.
Cost makes good sense to me.
Yeah, it could be. Okay. All right, well, that's fine. This is where you would see the costs and where you can configure the thresholds for your costs. So if you want to be notified when costs are exceeded and not let this thing run and run and run, you can do that as administrator. So I've said the cost of my lab is $50, plus notify me at various steps towards that $50 limit.
Is that aggregated or is that per lab? Or?
That's for the whole lab, all the machines and things inside that lab. That's really bugging me. I'm going to refresh my browser. Bear with me 1 second. This may or may not come back. Okay. Well, normally there's a graph here, and it was there yesterday, coming up of costs as it goes up over time for this particular environment. You can see the costs per resource as well, and see the individual resource of those costs. This is probably why this lab is not showing me anything. So again, that was there yesterday. So in terms of like how you would start to lock this down, by default, it's kind of all open, just like the rest of Azure. But if you want to, as an administrator, start to control what people can do. So I've limited the VM sizes. Now this has started to be an absolutely huge list. as we've added more and more to the alphabet soup of VM sizes. So, you know, there's stuff in here you really don't want developers building. You know, a standard M128, I think it's got like 20 terabytes of memory and 128 cores. It's just, you know, the cost would be astronomical even if you're running it for a few hours. And the same a lot of this stuff, you know, you want to be able to standardize on some basic sizes, basic images that you're going to build for your lab environments. So I've limited this to a few flavors in here, AV2s and some AV1s, because you know these are dev and test environments. These aren't production environments at the end of the day. You can further limit, you know, how many VMs people can build. So I've turned this on and say person's only allowed 10, and in total in this lab there's only allowed to be 30 virtual machines. So this is where I can set that announcement. So I put a markdown in there and various other configuration things about sort of the kind of user experience when they first enter the lab. So one of the big aspects of dev test labs was the auto shutdown and auto start. We're moving some of this capability. Some things come first to dev test labs and then move to general purpose VMs. So for a long time you couldn't have auto shutdown on a VM that you built directly in Azure, but you could in dev test labs. So we kind of start to move the features from dev test labs into general VMs. So this has been enabled, so all my VMs by default will shut down at 7 PM unless they opt out of that policy.
Is that a wake-up time as well?
Auto start, that's a wake-up time, so these will all switch back on at 7 AM in the morning. By default, I think this is off, so things will shut down, but they won't start back up, which is, you know, a further cost saving. Unless the developer goes in and starts starting it up. So you can further customize this with bringing in your own repositories of artifacts. So there's a Microsoft published one, which has a load of sample software and things that you might want to put into your virtual machines. And I've created my own custom repo here, which is over in GitHub. So if I copy and paste this URL, this is in my GitHub repo. So we've got these two folders in here, an ARM folder where I've created some ARM templates, and I've created this artifacts folder where I have these other directories in here with JSON descriptions of how to apply these artifacts. So these could be scripts, these could be commands to run. So this one's quite a simple one. It's got a kind of bash script and an artifact file associated with it. So you tell Dev Test Labs about the Git repository and those two folder paths where you're storing all of that stuff. What all that does will become clear in a minute. If you want to further customize what people can do, you really want to limit by the marketplace images they can use, or you might not let them use marketplace images at all. You might have to be only your own custom images that you've created. This takes a little while to come back because there's now so many images in the marketplace. So again, I've limited this to some standard operating systems, some Red Hat, Ubuntu, Windows Server, Windows 10, you know, and the rest of that list, all of that confusing stuff, it won't be available to them. So it stops developers and people going off and saying, oh, I'll just try this out on Core OS and, you know, start going off down strange tangents. Yeah, we'll talk about custom images. So if you build your own custom images of VMs, this is where they would appear. And same with formulas. So a formula is a combination of two things. It's a formulation of a base image, the operating system, and any software and artifacts you layer on top. If you find yourself doing that again and again, you can create a reusable formula that people can use. So what does this mean in terms of usability? So that was kind of like the admin side. In terms of usability, there's two things you can do to get a virtual machine. You can come into the claimable. So this is much more of a lab use case or a training use case, where I could claim a virtual machine that's been pre-built for me. So the developer, the trainer or whoever's running the lab can pre-build these machines, and I can come in and claim them and say that one's mine for the purposes of this lab. That saves me going in and building it or knowing anything about Azure or Dev Test Labs. As you can see, actually, this one's been set to auto shut down, opted in, but auto start is opted out. So this one will be shut down until I start it. I can do various tasks in here like start and stop, even though I might not have admin rights in the Azure subscription. So what Dev Test Labs is doing on your behalf is these operations to the virtual machines. If I went in as a user to that resource group and to those virtual machines, I wouldn't be able to do anything on them. So I can actually create a new virtual machine. So DevTest Labs has been started all around VMs, and that's kind of where it began. And then sometime last year, we added the capability to deploy through ARM as well. And with an ARM template, well, kind of world's your oyster then. You can deploy anything. It doesn't have to be virtual machines. So this one particularly, this ARM template here, actually deploys a web app and a SQL DB as platform services, and no virtual machines are going to be created.
That's your environment parameters file.
Yes. Yeah, and yes, there's a parameters file in front of this, and it's kind of prompted me for all those parameters, whereas you were setting all of those parameters inside the build process.
The licensing of the Visual Studio VM and the use of Visual Studio outside of any MSDN agreement?
I think it depends on the marketplace terms and conditions for that offer. I don't know what it is in the marketplace. That's just taking the standard. If I went to the marketplace here and decided to go and shopping for Visual Studio, it will be taking whatever the terms and agreements are of that. So I can't quite remember what they specifically are. Yeah, that one's community.
That one was enterprise, though, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what the terms are.
This one would install it, but you still have to log into Visual Studio to license it.
Yeah.
So I'm paying for the VM, and then on top of that, I need some sort of license.
Yeah.
'Cause I have to log in.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, DevTest Labs is just sort of a layer on top of the standard standard capabilities. So yeah, my base doesn't have to be a virtual machine. It could be an ARM template, which has come from that custom repository I created in Git, or it can be one of these formulas. So I've created a formula here, which is layering a few things together, or it can just be a basic image from the gallery. So I can say VM lab 1, 2, 3, 4. And so it's a nicer experience. If you ever tried creating a VM in Azure, you've got prompted things like your storage accounts and networks and subnets and all this stuff that would, if you weren't familiar with it, can be a bit confusing. All of that's kind of hidden away. I don't even have to enter my password or SSH keys because that's already stored in the key vault. I can layer those artifacts on. So here we can see these are all the standard Microsoft stuff in that public repo, and then those two that I had in my Git repo come in here as well. So these scripts will get run on top of the VM once it's been created.
Do we have to choose which region my VM stood up in?
That's picked for you by the DevTest Lab. So the DevTest Lab lives in a region. So again, that's all of these choices that you would normally have to pick if you're building a VM directly in Azure. A lot of that's been hidden away.
More than one region, I have more than one test lab.
Yeah.
If you want to, you can extract the entire lab after you configure it as an ARM template, itself.
Yeah.
And you just stand it up in other regions.
One of the things people do to save costs is not give every machine a public IP address. So it will put a load balancer in there, and you go to a NATed address. If you want a SSH or RDP on there, you're going to go through a different port to get to different machines. That's quite a complex thing to set up yourself, but DevTest Labs do that for you. You can actually blow away the VM after a certain date, not just shut them down, but actually delete them. And if I was making this claimable for other people, and I said I want 10 of them, it would build a whole suite of them ready for people to be able to pull down and use. Let's just go ahead and create it. So yeah, that really is kind of DevTest Labs in a nutshell. Yeah, it's an easy way of getting access to environments and virtual machines, building them in a standard way with standard templates. Some of the stuff that's difficult to do with normal VMs is quite easy. Things like create custom image. For those of you who've done this on top of Azure, where you've had to sysprep and generalize the VM and then store it in a storage account and all of this stuff, DevTest Labs makes this easy for you. And I can just create a new image from a VM. It's going to shut that down, generalize it for me, and store it in the storage account for other people to start using. So if you built up a VM with a load of tools and software on it, it's built a very specific way, as normally is the case. You want to sort of capture that somehow. This is how you do that, store that as a build image. So there we go, we've covered quite a lot. Team services, DevOps projects, application insights, DevTest Labs. Thank you.